Hello and welcome to the 5th video in our parish mission. Before I begin, I'd like to make a little confession. You might notice that the lights are a little darker this evening, and I don't normally record in the evening, but earlier this afternoon I was making an attempt at doing another recording, and about 10 minutes into the talk I just had to stop. There was no way around it. And I wasn't emotional or I didn't have an onrush of feeling. I just immediately felt that I wasn't ready to do it. So I stopped. And I couldn't quite figure out why I wasn't ready until about 20 minutes later when I just realized that I don't want to say too angry, but indignant. I was too indignant. I was listening to myself describe Father Rodrigues, Father Ferreira, and I was noticing in my own heart this desire to expose why they went wrong. All the while, I was trying to explain the tenderness of Jesus for those who even reject his love. Knowing the discordance between my emotions and thoughts and the actual content that I was trying to present, I now know that it was right that I stop. And so now, several hours later, after dilly-dallying around for several hours, watching lots of videos about all the different crises that are going on in the world, cleaning up a little bit, and then night prayer, then I picked up the book again, and I just decided to read a few chapters. And it was not as if I gained a new idea. And I can't even be sure that what I'm saying now is right. But this is the best I can do. And the best I can do is realize that the characters in this book represent so many different characteristics and parts of our church life, of our Christian life, that we must show all of them a certain amount of tenderness, even if we don't like them, because the likelihood that we will become them is very, very high. That being said, the last time we left off, there was the debate and discussion between Father Ferreira and Father Rodrigues. Father Ferreira had now fully apostatized, taken on a Japanese name, and renounced the faith. And he has another job. And his job is to make Father Rodrigues apostatize and deny the faith. And he's even writing a book now under the instruction of the Inquisitor to explain why Christianity is a deception, or a deception unmasked. He wants to unmask the deception of Christianity. And throughout the conversation, Father Ferreira kind of has this almost pitiable attitude. I can be of service. I can be useful. And it echoed for me in many different areas, because a lot of missionaries burn out because they try to be of use. And if there's anything that the missionary often realizes is, in fact, how useless they are to the people that they are evangelizing. Unless they have a skill or something to bring to the table that the people they're missionizing to actually want to listen, then they become, as Chesterton describes of clergy, as useless as a cat. But Chesterton did admit that there's a reason for the cat's existence. But often it is in the unnecessary. And so Father Ferreira had this kind of vanity about him, that he wanted to be of service. And to see all of it fall apart was the real wound in him. In fact, the wound is brought out specifically when Father Rodrigues in the conversation points out the success of the mission, and that is the moment that his steel resolve, Father Ferreira's steel resolve, comes out, where he said, when was it successful? When? And he describes himself as trying to understand that the faith that they had been preaching the missionaries had been preaching was not the faith that the people had received. And he describes himself as a missionary worn out through missionary work. He didn't find it a joy because it wasn't the missionary work that he was interested in. And so Inoue saw through that, gave him a job that padded the ego. But the sad thing is the torment that Father Ferreira would undergo and the loss of self symbolized by his taking on of a new name, a new identity, a new wife, children, shows that he's still caught between two worlds. And it's being caught between two worlds that is a terrifying suffering that I don't think I could endure. But Father Ferreira seemed to be undergoing it. And Inoue suspects that Rodrigues would fall. And so putting him later in a jail cell, preparing Rodrigues for his final torment. But the final torment of Rodrigues will not be under the rack. Father Rodrigues will not be put on the pit like the threat had been made. The pit, in case you missed it, or I forgot to mention it, is that they would be hung upside down, tied up and bound, unable to be moved, and wrapped in cloth with a slit around their neck so that they bleed out, and their head is placed inside a hole in the ground. Father Rodrigues is not put in the pit. Instead, Japanese Christians who had apostatized are placed in the pit in his stead. Several of them. And he's told that unless he apostatizes, they will continue to suffer. And the pressure only mounts when Father Ferreira says to him, if Christ were here, he would apostatize. All the time mocking the attempt at prayer and of having God bring his assistance. Now, just before Father Rodrigues is placed before an image of Christ, Rodrigues has a moment of silence. And he hears a voice say to him, "Come along, step on me." Very soon after, Father Rodrigues tramples on the fumée and the cock crows. This leads to an interesting duality. Were the words "step on me" actually uttered by Christ or by a tempting figure deceiving Father Rodrigues? But the author seems to make it abundantly clear that it was a denial of the Lord by having the cock crow. Then why would Jesus say, "Step on me"? Now, it could be a deception. But maybe, just maybe, it is the fulfillment of the very statement that the whole book is a reflection on. Those words of Jesus to Judas Iscariot, "What you are to do, do quickly." Jesus says those words to Judas Iscariot because Judas knows what he's going to do, and he knows what he's going to do is right. There are a few occasions when Judas reveals a bit of his character, and he is able to hide his money laundering with a supposed love for the poor, or a desire to make sure that the poor are taken care of while he's keeping the money, and especially in reference to the woman at Bethany. But the denial of Rodrigues was long in the coming. It happened in the very beginning of the book when he insisted on going. when he insisted on going to Japan, even though it had been made abundantly clear to him by Father Valignano, by the superiors of the Jesuits, by reality itself, by the Japanese Christians who received him, that he did not quite understand this mission. But he wanted to go because it was the right thing. And the sad thing is the one critique that Father Ferreira had of Father Rodrigues was this. The one critique that was truly accurate is that they weren't dying for God, they were dying for you. Now, that's not entirely true insofar as the conscience of those Japanese Christians goes, but it was definitely true about Father Rodrigues. You'll notice that he breaks down when he apostatizes, but he is quite content to tell the villagers, Kichijiro, a whole host of people to apostatize so that they might be spared. It's his pride. It's his pride on being the missionary with the most that already laid the foundation of his downfall. Seen in a sense from the lens of eternity, he had already made his choice. And so Jesus says to him, what you're doing, too quickly. And I find that Jesus says that to us almost every day. There are certain sins that people struggle with and don't know how to break out of. There are certain vices and attachments and desires that enslave God's people. And there's no easy way out of them. Because after Rodrigues began his own mission, by biting off more than he could chew, he had to learn the real point of faith, which is to be humble before the Lord. And he could no longer do it the way he had intended. The mighty will be cast down from their thrones, and God will lift up the lowly. He finally now understands Kichijiro. Kichijiro is afraid of suffering, pain. Rodrigues and Ferreira are afraid of not being important. And whenever we evangelize, we must be very careful as to what our motivation is in the doing it. For instance, very often we'll evangelize our family members or our friends or our co-workers at work, and we will do so almost as if we're treating them as if they're a feather in our cap, or a sign of the strength of faith in our family or in our community. But we don't preach and evangelize to turn other people into a feather in our cap. Jesus is meant to be the life. Jesus is the life. And so consequently, if we're using the proclamation of the life of Jesus as a means to our own ends, we're not proclaiming Jesus. And they'll see right through it. Just like Inoue saw through Father Rodrigues and Father Ferreira. He knew them. He himself was a Christian. So was the translator. They'd seen it. And they rejected it. And so insisted then not to take an outside faith, not to take a foreign wife, but one's own. Now, interestingly, Inoue eventually gives Father Rodrigues a Japanese wife, just as he gave one to Father Ferreira. In fact, both the wife and the children of Fathers Rodrigues and Ferreira are the inheritance of a dead man. It already underlies the larger problem that Inoue knows but cannot fix. That there's a vast difference between how a man is perceived to be and who he is. This whole thing that you can just marry a person off by contract is the fundamental problem, and yet something that the two priests and Inoue themselves were unable to do. So while informing Father Rodrigues of his new wife, nearing the end of the book, Father Rodrigues encounters a different side to Inoue's character. And I'm going to read this section to you. On January 4th, Rodrigues received a summons from the magistrate's office. The interpreter had arrived with a palanquin. There was no wind, but the sky was dull and cloudy. It was a rather cold day. Was it because of the ceremony of the fumée? The sloping road was utterly changed from the previous day, for it had become deadly still and quiet. At the magistrate's office of Hon Hakata, an official dressed in ceremonial clothes was waiting. "The magistrate awaits you," he said. The Lord of Chicago squatted erect in a room which was placed a single brazier. Hearing the sounds of footsteps, he turned full upon the priest, that face with its big ears. Around his cheeks and lips there played a smile, but there was no laughter in his eyes. "Greetings," he said quietly. This was the first meeting with the magistrate since his apostasy, but now he felt no sense of disgrace in the presence of this man. It was not against the Lord of Chicago and the Japanese that he had fought. Gradually he had come to realize that it was against his own faith that he had fought. But he could scarcely expect the Lord of Chicago to understand a thing like that. "It is a long time since we have met," nodded Inoue, stretching his hands over the brazier. "I suppose you are quite accustomed to Nagasaki now." He then went on to ask the priest if he were undergoing any discomfort, and if so, he should make it known at once. The priest saw at once that the magistrate was trying to avoid any mention of the fact of his apostasy. Was this out of consideration for his feelings, or was it simply the self-confidence of the victor? The priest would sometimes raise his lowered eyes to scrutinize the other's face, but the expressionless countenance of the old man told him nothing. "In a month's time, it would be good for you to go to Edo and live there. There is a house prepared for you there, Father. It is a house in Kobinetacho, the place where I used to live." Had the Lord of Chicago deliberately used the word father? It cut bitterly in the priest's flesh. "Moreover, since you are going to spend your life in Japan, it would be good for you to take a Japanese name. Fortunately, a man named Okada Sanimon has died. When you go to Edo, you can take his name just as it is." The magistrate spoke the words in a single breath, rubbing his hands as he held them over the brazier. "This man has a wife," he went on. "It will be inconvenient for you, Father, to be always alone, and so you can take her as your wife." The priest had been listening to these words with downcast eyes. Besides his eyelids arose the picture of a slope down which he kept slipping endlessly. To resist, to refuse, this was no longer possible. Whatever about adopting a name of a Japanese, he had no intention of taking his wife. "Well?" asked Inoue. "Very good." Shrugging his shoulders, he nodded, and feeling an exhausted resignation took possession of his whole being. "You underwent every kind of insult. If you alone now understand my feelings, that is enough. Even if the Christians and the clergy look upon me as a blot in the history of the mission, that no longer matters to me. I've told you, this country of Japan is not suited to the teaching of Christianity. Christianity simply cannot put down roots here." The priest remembered how Ferreira had said exactly the same thing as Saishoji. "Father, you were not defeated by me." The Lord of Chicago looked straight into the ashes of the brazier as he spoke. "You were defeated by this swamp of Japan." The words calling Japan a swamp, echoed by Father Ferreira and Inquisitor Inoue, eventually becomes something that Father Rodrigues himself will accept. Rodrigues, who gets his name changed to Okado Sanimon. But that underlines something, a dangerous problem that Inoue and Ferreira and now Rodrigues all share. A certain contempt for Japan. You don't call something a swamp with affection, unless you really like swamps. Also in the conversation between Father Ferreira and Father Rodrigues, that the swampiness of Japan, the poison that it is reflective of nature itself, of the nature of reality. And I think that is the root of why they fail. Pride has two sides to it. Pride has self-love, and it also has self-contempt. It has an exaltation of another, but it also has the contempt of the other. The proud man exalts himself, but with a reason. He looks at himself with pride and joy, and therefore looks at anything that is not himself with contempt. But, like a parasite, pride needs something to have underfoot. It needs to be able to look at something and say, at least I'm better than that. And that is the one thing that Father Rodrigues, Father Ferreira, and Inquisitor Inoue did not understand about God. His very presence in our midst is his infinite humility. Behind me in the darkness is a tabernacle that I have set up in my living room. It's in a wood box on a fireplace, apparently being recorded in a talk. Now, one could easily say, and probably with good reason, that that is beneath God's dignity. And I would agree. But it's a price that he's willing to pay precisely by the nature of the sacrament itself. The nature of the sacrament is God's desire to be present in our midst, even if that is not in accord with his dignity, even if it's not in accord with how we would look at God as deserving to be treated. And yet he does. Now I do everything I can to not presume on that intimacy, examining my conscience before I go to reconciliation and before I receive communion, celebrating the sacraments worthily and well as the priest that God has called me to be. But on the day of my baptism, on the day of my confirmation, on the day of my ordination, and every single time I receive communion, the unworthiness of this creature to celebrate those sacraments becomes abundantly clear. But I might be a swamp, but I'm a swamp that's loved. You might look at yourself with contempt and dislike and want to bring out the characteristics and qualities about yourself that you truly do love. And great. It's great to have missionaries that are able to bring their best talents forward. But never forget the most valuable gift that you have to bring. Your trust in God's mercy. In almost every talk, I've tried to sneak in that passage from the letter to the Hebrews, where it points out that our Lord Jesus Christ, being the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, heedless of the shame that is brought on to him because of his love for us, is also then to redeem us. So how could we possibly heal and evangelize a world with the loving tenderness of Christ if we have not believed it for ourselves? Now, what I'm going to say has all of the pathetic triteness of a Westerner looking out from the inside. But if there's one thing that Japan understood better than missionaries ever thought they could, is that difference between that inner part of you that you protect and that outer person that the world can see. The missionaries almost took their external personality as their innermost desires for granted. But when these two priests are given wives and names and identities, it's known to be merely external. They've taken on the life of a dead man. That is not who they are. And so there's an inner part of them that is imprisoned. And the very fact that throughout the rest of their lives, Inoue makes Rodrigues and Ferreira constantly renew their apostasy is a sign of that human torment. So the nature of the swamp is the shame. And if Christians aren't willing to embrace their own shame, they will be ineffective in a place like Japan. They'll be ineffective in a place like our world, which is only gradually catching up to where Japan was culturally 300 years ago. I think we have a whole lot to learn. And I think that's what every missionary ought to do when he goes out in mission. Yeah, go out, tell people about Jesus. But first go out and say, what does this culture have to teach me? In preparing for this, I watched lots of videos about cultural differences between the West and Japan. And one of them, who is my particular favorite, he has this kind of look of awe and reverence when somebody's describing their personal experiences. And I am heartfeltly touched by that. He wants to understand what this Westerner, what this Japanese person honestly thinks about something. How is that important to you? His questions verge on the most plainly prosaic to, what do you like about girls in Japan? What do you like about Western guys? What do you like about Western girls? What do you like about Japanese boys? All of these different questions allow the person to express their innermost heart without being judged or criticized. And you can see them kind of bubble out when they notice that he just wants to know. But what's so interesting about part of this guy's conversations is when he asks people in Japan about God, and what their response is very much what our world is today. Well, I guess I believe, but I haven't put that much thought into it. Most people out there have put more thought than they might even be willing to admit, or that they might even know. Not only that, but even though the religious customs in Japan are quite different than that of the West, he points out in his videos as well that they're not as entrenched as they are in the West. You go to a Buddhist temple or to a Shinto thing, and we often think of religion there as religion. But it's not accurate. That's more Western imperialism about how culture should work. Japan is Japan. Get to know the people of Japan. Learn to love them. Your kid is your kid. Learn to love them. Not for what you want them to be, but for who they are. Priests have to do the same thing. My dear people of Christ the King, I didn't pick you, but I'm happy God gave them to you. I'm happy God gave you to me. It required a bit of pain. It required a bit of sorrow. But all of those different things are required. And so now, having this desire to go out and meet you, I'm trapped at home. I would love to be able to go out in mission, to go and to visit the sick, to be the priest that I always know that I should be. But right now, my bishop and my church and my civil authorities have told me to stay home. So I'll obey, because I don't want to wind up like Father Rodrigues. I don't want to wind up sorrowful in my own self. I don't want to be angry at the fate that had befallen me. The tragedy for Father Ferreira and for Father Rodrigues is that they hated each other at the end. They knew what one represented for the other. I can't be the priest I feel I ought to be. That's just fine. You might be wanting to be holier than you are now. So be it. Take the shame, embrace it, and give it back to Jesus. And you just might. At the end of the book, the hero of the story, who's not Jesus, because it goes without saying it's Jesus, but the hero of the book is revealed. It was Kichijiro. The story is told indirectly through the record of a Dutch merchant. But it turns out that Kichijiro found his courage. He didn't ask to suffer. He didn't want it. And he failed repeatedly and asked for confession and forgiveness again and again, even from a fallen priest. But just like St. Peter, there came a day when he gave his life for God. And for that, we can be hopeful. Stay home, at least for now. Pray for all those out there who are working for your well-being. Pray for your family. Pray for me. And pray for all those who do not know the merciful kindness of our loving God. Thank you.